I'm Ayala Weinberg, currently a resident of Baltimore, Maryland. I'm the child of Rabbi Yonah Monk and Yafa Monk, and Yonah Monk Alav HaShalom. He should rest in peace. My parents have a very interesting story in how they met, and that will lead you to hear about their background. My father grew up as the youngest of 3 children, and he was born in Romania but raised in Czechoslovakia. And the Germans had just started to invade Germany in 1938, and the community was very on top of trying to get their children out. And my father was the youngest. They wanted to get him out first. He was going on a kinder transport. At the time, he was around 14, 15 years old. And a group of boys and girls, 15, 6-year-olds, were sent by the community on this kinder transport, but this kinder transport actually failed midway. It was headed to England. He had a home set up to be in. He was going to study in a yeshiva in Manchester, in England, and they made it from Czechoslovakia all the way to Belgium, and the Gestapo had found out about it. My father was actually wearing tefillin at the time, and he refused to take it off in front of the Gestapo. But unfortunately, they had to get off the train, and they found themselves in Belgium, in Brussels, and they went to something that was very similar to the Joint Distribution Committee. As we go to federations in our communities, they had to go somewhere, and they said, we're a bunch of young people. We were supposed to get to England. What do? We need money at least to get back to our families. So everybody was being watched in Germany and Belgium. The Germans at this point were watching money and, exchange of money. But they gave them enough money to get to Frankfurt. So some of the girls decided to stay behind. They didn't want to go. Until today, my father doesn't really know where they ended up or how they ended up. But a group of them went back and got all the way till Frankfurt. And he said it was not too long after Kristallnacht. And so you could see all the stores, all the glass in the shops were broken in. So he said, where do we go? So they went to the synagogue. They heard there was a synagogue there, and they went and they said, wait for the rabbi, he's not here. And they waited for a while, and then he went in to speak to the rabbi and said, we're a bunch of young people. We were supposed to get to England. We have no money. All our money was used for this kinder transport. And most of the kinder transports had gotten through, but towards the end, word was getting out, and many of them were starting now to get caught. And so the rabbi said, so we said we need money just to get back to Czechoslovakia. So he said, the Germans are counting our money, but the rabbi of Frankfurt said, I will give you the money to get back. So they got back, and his 2 older brothers had tickets to get on the very last youth boat that was getting out to Palestine. And usually it was a small boat going out to meet a larger boat. So it was the day that his 2 older brothers were going. He no longer could get on the kinder transport. So he was going to go into hiding with his parents. Or they were going to figure out what else to do, but they didn't have it. But a cousin was present at the seeing off at the boat and said to my uncle, the middle brother, you need to get Yonah on the boat. And he said, how? And they put a coat on him, and they gave him a suitcase. And I asked my father, how'd you get on the boat? You didn't have a ticket. And he said, Jews, sometimes they're very impatient. And suddenly there was this big push, and I was on the boat. Eventually he did get caught as a stowaway, and he said normally they would send you back on that small boat and not meet the larger boat. But he begged, and he became the kitchen cleaner, cook, and he had to do everything with the kitchen, and he hid. In the meantime, my uncle saw that my father got on the boat and turned to my grandmother and said, Yonah's on the boat. And she said, what? And tell him to come and give his mother a kiss, goodbye. And he said he can't, and she cried. And that was the last time my father saw my grandmother. So they took this boat and they got into Palestine, and 3 brothers were in Palestine and eventually joined the Haganah. They lived there, they studied there, they made a home there. They were with some cousins as well that got out with them, some first cousins, and they all stuck together. And as the years progressed, my father was part of the Haganah. And in the meantime, my mother was from Hungary, and towards the end of the war, they ended up in the ghetto. My great uncle was the chief rabbi of Budapest, and my grandfather was the rabbi of a small town called Onod and 30 surrounding towns, and he had to be the head of the ghetto. They ended up in concentration camps. My mother and her sister survived, unfortunately lost her brother and father. and mother, and ended up in Budapest for a while and saw there was no life really for them, that she felt expelled by her own country, and said the only place for her to go was Israel. She was not going anywhere else other than what would be a homeland for her. So she and her sister in the night went on this youth Aliyah boat, climbed through the snow in the mountains. It actually can be seen on another film called Faith and Fate by Beryl Wine. You can actually see my mother's interview and actually see them. They were filmed actually in the dark, getting to this boat. They got to Israel eventually, and the British didn't want to let them in. And so they cried and they sang Shema, very similar to the Exodus story, and eventually they let them in and took them to Atlit. So my mother and sister were in Atlit for a while and eventually got in and went to live with an uncle and aunt in Jerusalem, and first cousins, and eventually went to school. And if you flash forward now a number of years, you're now in 48, and Jerusalem was under siege, and it was dangerous for the students and the seminary girls and all the students there. So the soldiers, the Haganah soldiers, went and brought the students to Tel Aviv because it was safer to be in Middle Israel. And imagine all these young people, sort of, walking around, flirting, and it's like suddenly they found themselves together. And my father saw my mother and said, "I can get her. She's very pretty." And so they actually started a relationship, and they dated for 2 years. She was an orphan, and eventually he wanted to marry her, and she said, "Well, you need to meet my uncle and aunt for permission, because I don't have parents, and that's like my father to me." So they went, and my great uncle and my father kept looking at each other, and they realized that he was the rabbi in Frankfurt who gave my father the money to get back home to his parents 10 years prior, in 1938. And this is now 1948. So my parents married, and my father was in the army, and my 2 older brothers were born there, and Israel was their blood. My father always said he had several mothers, and he always called Israel his mother. He had his real mother, his biological mother, who unfortunately my grandparents got caught in hiding and didn't make it in. But he said he had his biological mother, and Israel was always his mother. It was the mother that saved him and his brothers.